Tensions are still simmering at the Ukrainian border, and in his latest remarks, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has blamed the West for escalating tensions across Europe. Speaking to senior military officials in Moscow, Putin has yet again warned the West, saying that Russia would respond adequately to any Western aggression and would even develop its army further. Meanwhile, as per reports, a hotline is now active between Moscow and Washington on the issue of security guarantees that are demanded by Russia as of now. This comes after Moscow last week presented a wish list of sorts of security proposals that it wants to negotiate with the United States in exchange for de-escalating tensions at the Ukraine border. And one of the demands includes a promise that NATO would give up any military activity in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, while the US has said that some of Russia's proposals are obviously unacceptable. It is ready to engage in diplomacy through multiple channels, including bilateral engagement.
We have been clear as the United States, and just yesterday the 30 nations of the NATO alliance were clear in a statement that came out of the North Atlantic Council. We're prepared for dialogue with Russia. We've had dialogue with Russia on European security issues. For the last 20 years, we had it with the Soviet Union for decades before that. That has sometimes produced progress, sometimes produced deadlock, but we are fundamentally prepared for dialogue. Russia has now put on the table its concerns with American and NATO activities. We're going to put on the table our concern with Russian activities that we believe harm our interests and values. That's the basis of reciprocity upon which you would pursue any kind of dialogue.
While Moscow is yet to receive any concrete answer from Washington, the US response is likely to shape Moscow's next steps over the topic of Ukraine, which has in recent months become the main flashpoint of tensions. Amid the back and forth, the Russian Defense Ministry released a video showing what they said was the first video of Orion, an unmanned aerial vehicle hitting an aerial target. The ministry further said that Orion hit a helicopter to drone during tests on the military training ground in Crimea. Orion can also conduct reconnaissance in far-off places for dozens of hours. Meanwhile, Ukraine held the first presidential trilateral meeting of a security alliance with Poland and Lithuania. President Zelensky reiterated Ukraine's wish to become a member of NATO, while Poland and Lithuania expressed support for preemptive measures against Russia.
Повинні бути потужні, превентивні речі, потужні, серйозні санкції, щоб навіть не було жодної думки щодо ескалації.
Наша дуже активна в цьому напрямку, і я глибоко вірю, що ми зможемо в результаті реалізації цієї політики побудувати сильну безпекову платформу для того, щоб захистити не лише держави НАТО, але й Україну від будь-яких дій, будь-якої російської агресії. Я хочу ще раз підтвердити, я вірю, що
The United States and its allies fear that Russia may be preparing to invade Ukraine, something that Moscow has denied. Russia has in turn blamed Russophobia and Ukraine's growing relationship with the NATO for causing the standoff to escalate so far. Now, for more updates on this story, joining us now is Stuart Smith from Moscow. Stuart, welcome to WION. Now, some strong words coming from the Russian president. He has blamed the West for a rise in tensions in Europe. Tell us more about what the Russian president is referring to and the consequences of his words, of course.
Well, Russia and the President Vladimir Putin have always said that at the end after World War II and during the Cold War, there was an agreement that NATO would not expand eastward, a verbal agreement given to the Soviet Union at the time and adopted by Russia. But as we've seen over the past few decades, more and more countries have elected to join NATO, most of them saying out of fear that Russia could take aggressive action against their countries. Now, Russia has seen that as a violation of an unwritten treaty and therefore has interpreted it throughout the last few decades as a sign of escalation of NATO intentions. Russia says NATO is acting aggressively by allowing countries to join the Western military alliance. Now, the latest discussion comes around Ukraine. NATO hasn't for a while, although promising that Ukraine could join one day, NATO hasn't realistically been looking at accepting Ukraine for a while. But we've seen Russia really take the initiative here. Not only has it amassed what Western intelligence reports say hundreds of, tens of thousands of troops near the Ukraine border, it's taken the initiative to lay out in black and white all of the issues that it's talked about with presidents of the United States for many years. It's laid out pretty much everything in this black and white wish list as a way to start dialogue. As NATO and the US say, they're happy for dialogue, but as you said earlier, many of these requests have already been firmly ruled out, and the question is, what will Russia do next? And the way President Putin is talking today makes it sound like the next step could involve military action.
Right. Now, Stuart, but the big question is, this seems to be a veiled threat of sorts coming from the Russian president, warning that the West, saying that Russia would adequately respond to any kind of Western aggression that it sees, and would even to an extent develop its army further. So how do we expect the US to respond to all these statements?
Yeah, that's right. Well, so far the US has been very quiet about exactly what it does and doesn't see as room for dialogue in these statements. There are things on there which the United States may be able to agree to, but there are things in there that even the US can't guarantee. Things that involve, for example, the other European allies, part of the NATO military alliance, agreeing themselves. The US, although it's the biggest and most powerful country in the NATO alliance, it doesn't have overall power, and these things would have to be debated by NATO countries. And they have said, well, there are reports at least, that NATO members are not happy that this list has been published, but do feel required to at least engage in some dialogue. So the United States will have to be very careful which battles it chooses to pick within this black and white text as to what exactly it does see as grounds for concession and what it doesn't. The other thing here is that Russia hasn't indicated where it might possibly be able to offer an olive branch towards the US, do something itself to mitigate the situation. Right. For example, it hasn't explicitly said that it would remove troops from the Russia-Ukraine border even if progress is made.
Right. Now, Stuart, you mentioned the word guarantees, which brings me to my final question. We've seen tensions simmer over the topic of Ukraine of late. Moscow, of course, is pressing Washington for certain security guarantees in exchange to de-escalate tensions on the Ukraine border. How do you see this dynamic panning out going forward?
Well, the fear of Ukraine is that without any firm agreements, that Russia might claim Ukraine took provocative actions, or that the US took provocative actions, even if they perhaps did not, and then Russia will be justified using force in return. So, for example, we heard today the defense minister saying that the US has 120 mercenaries in Ukraine, in the contested Donbass region, and said that they're potentially planning to carry out a chemical attack. Now, we've not heard any response from the US, and this is the first time anyone's hearing anything like this, and so it's that kind of claim which then Russia could later use to justify some kind of invasion that Ukraine is worried about. Russia said it's worried about the same thing, that Ukraine could come up with some sort of made-up provocation and then use that to take action in Donbass. So a lot of this also revolves around not just what states are willing to do, but what states are willing to say about the other one is willing to do. And the lack of trust throughout all of this makes negotiations very difficult.
Indeed. Stuart Smith, thank you so much for all those insights, and thanks for joining us on WION at this hour. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.